tear down his fence. This is community property now.
That's the order the developer gave, while his crew ripped 3 sections of my fence line off the posts and dumped gravel across 2 acres of my pasture. My family has owned this land since 1958, 4 generations. But a forged survey moved our property line 200 feet south, and suddenly my barn, my dock, and my pasture belonged to the HOA. The developer's sister-in-law ran the board. Her cousin signed off on the new plat. They built 100 luxury homes on a floodplain my great-grandfather's levy had been holding back for 60 years. Nobody told the buyers. Nobody bought flood insurance. And nobody asked what would happen if the man maintaining that levy decided to stop. I'm a land surveyor. I found the fraud, and I let the water do the rest. The first thing you hear is the water. Not a rush, not a roar. A hiss. Like the ocean whispering a secret kept for 60 years. I stood on my back porch with coffee going cold in my hand. Below me, salt water threaded through cracks in the levee like fingers prying open a door. It crept across manicured lawns. It swallowed driveways. It kissed the thresholds of 100 front doors that cost more than my truck. And I just watched. They built 100 mansions on a swamp. Then they stole my land to pay for it. What they forgot is that the only thing between their marble countertops and the Atlantic Ocean was a dirt wall my great-grandfather built in 1962. A dirt wall on my property. So before you judge me, let me tell you how we got here. And I promise, by the end, you'll understand why I let every one of those homes flood. If this story doesn't make your blood boil, nothing will. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done. My name is Bennett Crawley. I'm 46 years old, 4th generation Low Country. My great-grandfather Emmett Crawley bought 120 acres of Beaufort County, South Carolina in 1958. Paid cash. Worked shrimp boats for 11 years to save the money. People told him he was crazy. Said the land was nothing but salt marsh and sand flats. Emmett didn't care. He saw home. The land sat along a tidal creek that fed into the broad river. Live oaks lined the ridges, their branches draped in Spanish moss so thick it looked like curtains. At low tide, the pluff mud smell hit you like a wall, that rotten egg stink that tourists hate and locals breathe in like perfume. It meant the marsh was alive. Emmett built a farmhouse on the highest ground. He raised cattle. He ran crab traps. He planted sweet corn that grew tall in the Carolina heat. Then Hurricane Donna came through in 1960 and put 3 feet of salt water across the whole property, killed the corn, drowned 2 cows, nearly broke Emmett's spirit. But Emmett Crawley was not a man who broke easy. He spent 2 years studying the tidal patterns, the creek elevations, the way storm surge funneled through the low country. And in 1962, he built a levee. Not concrete, not steel. Dirt. Compacted clay and earth, packed tight by hand and tractor, running a 1/4 mile along the tidal creek. Folks laughed. A dirt wall against the Atlantic. But Emmett understood the land. That levee held through Hurricane Hugo in 1989. It held through Floyd in 1999. It held through Matthew in 2016. 60 years of storms, and not one drop of tidal surge crossed that wall. My grandfather maintained it. My father maintained it. And when my father passed in 2011, I took over. I'm a licensed land surveyor, have been for 22 years. I know every property line, every easement, every flood zone in Beaufort County. I married Jolene in 2008. She's a school librarian, the kind who memorizes every kid's reading level and slips them books she knows they'll love. Our boy Grayson was 12 that year, tow-headed kid with sunburned ears who spent every afternoon fishing in the tidal creek. We weren't rich, but we had the land, and the land had us. That's how it works in the Low Country. You don't own the dirt owns you. Everything changed in the spring of 2019. I heard the bulldozers before I saw them. 6 in the morning, the roar of diesel engines ripping through the quiet like a chainsaw through silk. I walked to the east fence line and watched them clear-cut 40 acres of maritime forest in a single week. Longleaf pines that had stood for a century came down like matchsticks. Within a month, the land was bare, red clay. A sign went up at the road. Palmetto Bluffs Estates, luxury living in the low country. Homes from $400,000 to $700,000. 100 luxury homes packed tight on a floodplain, with swimming pools and 3-car garages. The construction traffic turned our quiet road into a highway. Dump trucks rattled the windows. Concrete mixers left gray dust on everything. The first time I met Darla Covington, she was standing at my fence line in a white linen pantsuit at 8 in the morning. Blonde hair shellacked into a helmet. Built like a woman who'd never missed a church potluck. She had a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Crawley?" she said, extending a hand with nails the color of arterial blood. "I'm Darla Covington, president of the Palmetto Bluffs Estates Homeowners Association." I shook her hand. It was like gripping a bag of warm sausages. "Your property is going to need some improvements if you want to fit in with the new community," she said. She looked past me at my barn, my tool shed, my fishing dock. The way she looked at them, you'd think she was cataloging evidence. "I don't recall asking to fit in," I said. She smiled that dead smile. "Well, we'll see about that." The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Certified mail. Return address, Palmetto Bluffs Estates, HOA, Legal Compliance Division. I tore it open on the porch. The letter informed me that 3 structures on my property were in violation of HOA architectural standards, Section 14.2b, unapproved structures in common areas. My barn, my tool shed, my fishing dock, structures my family had built and maintained for decades, on our own land. I read the letter twice. Then I read it a third time, because I was sure I was losing my mind. My property was not in the HOA. I had never signed a covenant. I had never agreed to any restrictions. My land predated their subdivision by 60 years. I called the HOA office. Got a receptionist who sounded like she was chewing gum through a head cold. "Ma'am, I'm calling about a violation notice I received. I'm not a member of your association." "Sir, if the structures are on HOA designated common area, the notice is valid regardless of membership status. They're on my land. According to our records, the structures are located on Parcel 7, Block C, which is designated as HOA common area per the 2019 county plat." I hung up, set the phone on the counter and stared at it like it owed me money. Then I drove to the Beaufort County Clerk's office and pulled the plat map. The fluorescent lights in that office hummed like angry wasps. The clerk's assistant handed me the document without looking up. What I saw made my stomach drop. The property line between my land and Palmetto Bluffs Estates had moved, not by a few feet, by 200 feet, 200 feet south into my property. According to the 2019 plat on file, my barn sat squarely on HOA common area. So did my tool shed. So did 3 acres of pasture where my grandfather used to run cattle. 15 acres of Crawley land had simply vanished, erased, redrawn with a new line that handed my family's property to Trent Covington's development. I drove home with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached, went straight to the fireproof safe in my office, pulled out the original 1962 survey that Emmett had commissioned when he bought the land, hand-drawn by a licensed surveyor named Holt, with meets and bounds recorded in black ink. I spread it on my desk next to a printout of the 2019 plat. The forgery was obvious, to me at least. The original boundary followed a natural ridgeline along the tidal creek. The new plat showed a straight line, ruler drawn, ignoring the topography entirely. No legitimate surveyor would have drawn that line. Someone had fabricated it. Outside my window, I could hear the thump and grind of pile drivers sinking foundations into the floodplain next door. The sound rattled through my chest like a second heartbeat. I called Darla the next morning. "The 2019 plat is a forgery," I said. "No greeting, no pleasantries. I have the original survey from 1962. Your brother-in-law moved my property line 200 feet to steal 15 acres. There was a pause. Then that dead smile crept into her voice. "The county records are the county records, Mr. Crawley. I suggest you comply." "Who signed off on this plat?" Another pause, longer this time. The county clerk processes all plat filings. I'm sure everything was done by the book. I already knew the answer, but I checked anyway. The county clerk who had certified the 2019 plat was a man named Wendell Pruitt. I looked him up. Wendell Pruitt was Darla Covington's first cousin. Here's what the Covingtons didn't know I knew. In South Carolina, filing a fraudulent land survey is a felony under SC Code Section 4021-390. It carries up to 5 years imprisonment. Every person who signed that plat, the surveyor, the clerk, the developer who ordered it, was looking at prison time. And I had the proof sitting in my fireproof safe. But I wasn't ready to play that card. Not yet. Because something told me this was only the beginning. The humidity that afternoon was so thick you could wring the air out like a washcloth. I sat on my porch and stared at the rooftops of 100 luxury homes that should never have been built. Somewhere in the marsh, a heron screamed. Trent Covington didn't waste time. 3 weeks after I confronted Darla about the forged plat, a convoy of trucks rolled down my access road at 6 in the morning. I heard them from bed. The low rumble of a diesel flatbed, the clank of a trailer loaded with equipment. By the time I got dressed and reached the east fence, Trent's crew had already unloaded a backhoe and was pulling up my fence posts. I'm not a man who raises his voice, but I raised it that morning. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" The foreman was a sunburned kid in a hard hat who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Got a work order, sir. Removing unauthorized fencing from HOA property and grading for an access road. This is my land." "Work order says different. Take it up with the developer." They pulled 60 fence posts that day, ripped them out of the ground like rotten teeth. Then they dumped 14 loads of crushed gravel across 2 acres of my pasture. Land my grandfather had seeded and fertilized by hand. Land where Grayson and I had spotted a family of foxes that spring, buried under 6 inches of gray rock. I called the Beaufort County Sheriff. Deputy showed up an hour later. Young guy, polite, completely useless. He walked the property line with me. I showed him the original survey. I showed him the forged plat. I explained the discrepancy. He scratched the back of his neck and sighed. "Mr. Crawley, I hear what you're saying, but this looks like a civil matter. Property disputes go through the courts. I can't intervene. They're destroying my land right now, right in front of you. I understand your frustration, but without a court order establishing the boundary, I can't determine who's right. I'd recommend you contact an attorney." He left. The backhoe kept digging. The next morning, I parked my truck across the access point where the gravel road entered my pasture, blocked the bulldozer from advancing further. I sat in the cab with the windows down. The air smelled like diesel exhaust and crushed limestone. Within an hour, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Different deputy this time. Older, meaner. "Sir, you need to move your vehicle. You're obstructing an authorized construction operation." "Authorized by who? This is my property." "Sir, the developer has a valid construction permit from the county. If you don't move your vehicle, I'll have to cite you for obstruction." I moved my truck. What choice did I have? They'd arrest me on my own land while the people stealing it watched. That night, around 9, the power went out. No storm, no wind, just darkness. Jolene was grading papers at the kitchen table. Grayson was doing homework in his room. 1 second the lights were on, the next, nothing. I went outside with a flashlight and followed the power line from the house to the road. Found the problem at the southeast corner of the property, right where Trent's crew had been working. The power line running from the utility pole to my house had been severed, cut, clean. The frayed ends dangled in the dark like dead snakes. I called the power company. They said they'd send a crew. When? We're backed up. 3 to 5 business days. 3 days. We lived 3 days without electricity in the South Carolina summer. Jolene taught her online classes by the glow of a camping lantern. Grayson did his homework by flashlight, lying on his stomach on the living room floor, because it was the coolest spot in the house. The food in the refrigerator spoiled. I threw away $100 worth of groceries. Jolene didn't say much during those 3 days. She didn't have to. I could see it in the way she moved. The tight shoulders, the pressed lips, the way she scrubbed the kitchen counter like she was trying to sand it down to nothing. "They can't do this, Bennett," she said on the second night. We were sitting on the porch because the house was too hot to sleep in. The air was thick and still. Mosquitoes whined in our ears. "No," I said, "they can't." When the power company finally came, I asked the lineman what caused the break. He looked at the cut and then looked at me. "Somebody cut this with bolt cutters," he said. "This wasn't an accident." That same week, I pulled Trent Covington's construction permit from the county records, read every page. On page 6, under prior land use, the permit described the site as previously unoccupied rural parcel with no existing structures or improvements. No existing structures, no improvements. 4 generations of Crawleys. Our farmhouse, our barn, our dock, our levee, erased with a single line on a government form. We didn't exist. We had never existed. I was in the barn sharpening a mower blade when Jolene's car came up the driveway too fast. Gravel sprayed. The door slammed. She came around the corner with a look on her face I'd never seen before. It was beyond anger. It was fear. "CPS is at the house," she said. "Child Protective Services?" They got a complaint, anonymous, said Grayson is living in substandard conditions without adequate electricity or running water. I set down the blade. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. We walked to the house together. 2 caseworkers stood on the porch, a man and a woman, both holding clipboards, both wearing that careful, neutral expression they must teach in social work school. They were polite, professional. They asked to see Grayson's room. They checked the outlets. They checked the water. They asked about the power outage. I explained everything, showed them the repair receipt from the power company, showed them that the electricity had been restored. The female caseworker made notes. The male caseworker looked around the property and actually smiled. "Nice place," he said. "That your dock down on the creek?" "Yes, sir. My grandfather built it." They left after 45 minutes. Case dismissed. No findings. But Jolene sat at the kitchen table after they drove away and cried. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet tears running down her face while she stared at nothing. "She called them on us, Bennett. She tried to take our son." I didn't have to ask who. We both knew. Darla Covington had weaponized a system designed to protect children and aimed it at a 12-year-old boy whose only crime was living next to her subdivision. The next week, every homeowner in Palmetto Bluffs estates received an email from the HOA board. I know because one of them, a decent man named Perry Ashworth, who'd bought a house on the north end, forwarded it to me. The subject line read, "Security Advisory, Adjacent Property." The email stated that the adjacent property owner was a squatter occupying HOA community land. It claimed legal action was pending to reclaim the land and remove the unauthorized occupant. It told residents to avoid contact with me and report any suspicious activity. Squatter. They called me a squatter on land my family had owned since Eisenhower was president. Perry Ashworth told me the email had generated a lot of talk. Some people were angry at me, a stranger they'd never met, based entirely on Darla's lies. Others were uncomfortable. "This doesn't feel right," Perry said, "but people just moved in. Nobody wants to rock the boat." 3 days after the email, Trent Covington called me directly. First time he'd ever bothered. His voice was smooth and warm, the voice of a man who sold things for a living. "Bennett, listen. I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we sit down and work this out like gentlemen?" "I'm listening." "I'll give you $50,000 for those 15 acres along the property line. Clean deal, no lawyers. We shake hands, sign the paperwork, and this whole headache goes away." $50,000 for 15 acres of low country land with creek frontage and old-growth oaks. Land worth $900,000 on a slow day. He wanted to buy my stolen property for 5 cents on the dollar and call it a favor. "My great-grandfather didn't build that levee so your brother could build mansions on a swamp," I said. Silence on the line. "You're making a mistake, Crawley." "I've been making mistakes my whole life, Trent. This isn't one of them." I hung up. That night, I drove out to the levee with a spotlight, walked the full length, checking for erosion, checking the compaction, the way my father taught me. And something caught my eye. The new homes on the other side, all 100 of them, sat low. Real low. No flood vents in the foundations, no elevated first floors, no breakaway walls. They were built like houses in Kansas, not houses on a tidal floodplain. I went home and pulled up the FEMA flood maps on my computer. According to the current map, Palmetto Bluffs Estates sat in Zone X, minimal flood hazard. No mandatory flood insurance required. I blinked at the screen. I'd been surveying this land for 20 years. I knew the elevations by heart. That area was Zone AE, high-risk flood zone, mandatory flood insurance, period. Someone had changed the designation, and without flood insurance, those 100 families were sitting in houses worth $400,000 to $700,000 with zero protection from the next storm surge. The crunching sound of tires on gravel pulled me to the window. Darla's white SUV idled at the end of my driveway. She sat there for a full minute, engine running, staring at my house. Then she backed out and drove away. I looked out at the subdivision. 100 rooftops glowed under the security lights where a forest used to stand. The independent surveyor I hired was a man named Lowell Fitch, 62 years old, licensed for 38 years, reputation like a church steeple, impossible to miss and hard to knock down. Lowell spent 3 days on my property with a total station and a GPS receiver. He pulled the original deed from the Beaufort County Register of Mesne Conveyances. He reviewed the 1962 Holt survey. He examined the 2019 plat filed by Trent's surveyor. His report was 12 pages long. The conclusion was one paragraph. The 2019 plat contained material discrepancies inconsistent with the established boundary. The northern boundary of the Crawley parcel had been displaced 200 feet south without legal basis. The 1962 boundary remained the valid property line. In plain English, the 2019 plat was a fake. 15 acres stolen with a pen and a rubber stamp. Lowell looked at me over his reading glasses. This isn't a mistake, Bennett. Someone deliberately falsified this plat. Whoever certified it was either blind or in on it. I thanked him, wrote him a check. Then I went after the second piece. I filed a Freedom of Information request with FEMA for the elevation certificates submitted for Palmetto Bluffs Estates. The documents arrived 3 weeks later. Every elevation certificate had been prepared by the same surveyor who drew the forged plat. Every certificate listed the base flood elevation at least 4 feet lower than the actual measurement. Based on those falsified certificates, FEMA had reclassified the area from Zone AE to Zone X, high risk to minimal risk. Lenders stopped requiring flood insurance. 100 families had bought homes in a flood zone without $1 of coverage. Falsifying FEMA flood zone maps violates the National Flood Insurance Act, Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 4012. The penalties include federal prosecution and personal liability for all resulting flood losses. Trent Covington would own every ruined floor, every waterlogged wall, every moldering strip of drywall in every single home. The financial exposure was staggering, but the deepest layer of the whole rotten scheme was the one that kept me up at night. I drove out to the levee at sunset. The tide was coming in. I watched the water press against the earthen wall my great-grandfather had packed with his own hands 60 years ago. On the other side, 100 homes sat on land that should have been underwater. Without that levee, every king tide would put a foot of brackish water across those foundations. Every tropical storm would push 4 feet of surge through the living rooms. And the levee sat on my property, my real property line, the one Emmett Crawley surveyed in 1962. I had zero obligation to maintain flood protection for homes built on stolen land. The total picture was clear. A forged survey worth $900,000, falsified FEMA maps, $40 million in uninsured homes, a corrupt county clerk, and my dirt wall, the only thing keeping 100 families dry. I sat on that levee as the sun went down. The marsh turned gold, then copper, then black. The Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, like the land itself was breathing. I had the nuclear option. The question was whether I should use it. I made my decision at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. Jolene was asleep. Grayson was asleep. The house was so quiet I could hear the tidal creek shifting against the bank a quarter-mile away. I had the Fitch survey, the FEMA records, the forged plat, and the original 1962 Holt survey spread across the table like a war map. And that's what it was, a war map. The first letter I drafted was to Darla Covington, Trent Covington, and the Palmetto Bluffs Estates HOA Board of Directors. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. The letter stated that the Crawley family levee, constructed in 1962 on Crawley property, maintained continuously for 60 years, was a private flood control structure on private land. Effective immediately, I was providing 60 days formal notice that all maintenance activities on the levee would cease. Under South Carolina property law, a landowner has no obligation to maintain flood control structures for the benefit of adjacent property, especially property acquired through fraud. I signed the letter, sealed it, set it on the stack. The second call I made was to an attorney named Vivian Garza. She practiced out of Charleston, specialized in land fraud, eminent domain, and federal environmental violations. Her reputation preceded her the way thunder precedes a hurricane. I'd found her name in 3 separate case studies where developers had tried to steal land through plat manipulation. All 3 developers were now broke or in prison. I called her office at 8 the next morning. Her paralegal put me through in under a minute. "Mr. Crawley, tell me the short version," she said. Her voice was calm, direct. The voice of someone who'd heard every scam in the Carolinas and wasn't impressed by any of them. I gave her the short version. Forged survey, stolen land, falsified FEMA maps, corrupt county clerk, 100 uninsured homes on a floodplain. "How fast can you get me copies of everything?" she asked. "I can drive them to Charleston today." "Don't drive, scan and encrypt. I want to file the federal complaint before they have time to shred anything." The third step was FEMA itself. I filed a formal complaint with the FEMA Office of Chief Counsel, alleging that elevation certificates for Palmetto Bluffs Estates had been falsified to reclassify a Zone AE flood area as Zone X. I included Lowell Fitch's independent survey data, the original elevation measurements, and the fraudulent certificates Trent's surveyor had submitted. Vivian told me the FEMA complaint would trigger an automatic investigation. No discretion, no burying it. Once the complaint was in the system, federal investigators were required to follow up. Then I did the hardest part. I went door to door. 100 homes, 100 families. I knocked on every single one. Perry Ashworth went with me. He'd read the evidence I'd shown him, the forged plat, the falsified flood maps, and his face had gone white. "These people need to know," he said. "They've got their life savings in these houses." We started on a Saturday morning. By noon, we'd hit 40 homes. I showed them the FEMA records. I showed them the real flood zone designation. I told every single one of them the same thing. "Your home sits in a high-risk flood zone. Your developer falsified the elevation certificates to avoid the designation. You have no flood insurance, and the levee protecting this subdivision is on my private property, and I am under no legal obligation to maintain it." Some people thanked me. Some people stared at me with hollow eyes. A woman on Palmetto Drive, young mother, 2 toddlers pulling at her legs, sat down on her front steps and put her head in her hands. "We put everything into this house," she whispered. A retired couple on Heron Lane pulled out their closing documents right there on the porch and started reading them with shaking hands. Others slammed the door. One man told me to get off his property, or he'd call the police. "Darla says you're a con artist trying to extort the neighborhood," he said. That was the word Darla was using, extortion. She was already spinning the narrative. But Perry kept knocking on the doors I couldn't open. He lived there. He was one of them. They trusted him more than they trusted me. By the end of the weekend, the word was spreading. The levee, the flood zone, the missing insurance. Jolene spent those nights organizing everything. She'd cleared the dining room table and turned it into Command Central. Color-coded folders, timelines, cross-referenced documents. The woman who memorized every kid's reading level could organize a federal case file like she'd been doing it her whole life. I sat beside her at midnight, listening to the creek rising outside our window. Rain had been falling since Tuesday. Steady, patient. The kind of rain that doesn't stop. The water in the tidal creek was higher than I'd seen it in months. I could hear it lapping against the base of the levee in the dark. A low, rhythmic pulse. Like something breathing. Like something waiting. Darla's response to the 60-day notice arrived exactly the way I expected. She ignored it completely. No reply, no acknowledgement, nothing. As if a certified letter hand-delivered to the HOA office had simply evaporated. What arrived instead, 9 days later, was a cease and desist from Trent Covington's attorney, a firm out of Columbia with a letterhead so thick you could shingle a roof with it. The letter accused me of intentional and malicious interference with property values. It threatened to hold me personally liable for any and all damages resulting from the deliberate failure to maintain existing flood infrastructure. It demanded that I immediately resume levee maintenance and withdraw my FEMA complaint. Vivian Garza read the letter over the phone and laughed. Actually laughed. "They're threatening to sue you for not maintaining your own property," she said. "That's like threatening to sue your neighbor for not mowing your lawn." 3 days after the cease and desist, Darla called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, but Perry Ashworth was. He recorded the whole thing on his phone. I listened to that recording in my truck, in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly, sitting in the dark with the engine off. Darla stood at the podium in the community clubhouse and told 100 homeowners that Bennett Crawley was holding their neighborhood hostage, that he was threatening to destroy the levee as blackmail to extract money from the HOA, that he was a bitter, unstable man who couldn't accept progress. She never mentioned the forged plat. She never mentioned the falsified FEMA maps. She never mentioned that 15 acres of my family's land had been stolen. She painted me as a terrorist and herself as the protector. And people believed her. Not all of them, but enough. The mood in the room was ugly. Perry said a man in the back row stood up and said, "Someone ought to teach me a lesson." Nobody disagreed. The brick came through my truck windshield 2 nights later. I was in the barn. Jolene heard the crash from inside the house. By the time I ran out, the road was empty. The brick sat on my passenger seat in a nest of shattered safety glass. No note, no message. The brick was the message. The next morning, Grayson asked me why someone broke our truck. I told him sometimes people get scared, and scared people do stupid things. He looked at me with those 12-year-old eyes that were getting older by the day. "Are we safe, Dad?" "Yes," I said. I wasn't entirely sure I was telling the truth. Trent moved fast after the HOA meeting. His lawyers filed an emergency motion in Beaufort County Court, seeking an injunction to compel me to maintain the levee. The argument was creative, I'll give them that. They claimed the levee was a community infrastructure asset, and that my refusal to maintain it constituted reckless endangerment of adjacent properties. Judge Marin Stillwell heard the motion on a Thursday afternoon. Vivian Garza stood before the bench and laid it out clean. The levee sat on private property. It had been built by a private citizen. It was maintained by a private family for 60 years. The adjacent development had been constructed through fraud on stolen land. "Your Honor," Vivian said, "you cannot compel a private landowner to maintain structures on his own property for the benefit of trespassers." Judge Stillwell denied the injunction. The ruling was 3 sentences long. The court finds no basis to compel maintenance of a private structure on private land. The developer's remedy lies in purchasing flood insurance or relocating affected structures. Motion denied. The ruling landed like a thunderclap, but Trent came to me, drove up my driveway at dusk, got out of a black Mercedes with mud on the tires. He looked different than the last time I'd seen him, thinner. The easy salesman's smile was gone, replaced by something harder, more desperate. $200,000, he said. No greeting, no small talk. $200,000 for the 15 acres and a maintenance agreement on the levee. $900,000 worth of land. He was offering less than a quarter of its value. And he wanted me to maintain flood protection for homes built on my stolen property. "Trent, here's something I think you need to hear," I said. "It doesn't matter what number you put on that check. You can't buy land you already stole, and you can't pay me to protect you from what's coming." He stared at me for a long moment. The cicadas were screaming in the oaks. The air was so heavy with moisture, it felt like wearing a wet shirt. "You're going to regret this," he said. He got back in the Mercedes and drove away. I watched his taillights disappear down the road. Then I walked out to the levee. The creek was high. The mud was soft at the base. I could see where the water had been working on the wall, the slow erosion that 60 years of tides had carved into the clay. Without maintenance, nature would do what nature always does. I didn't build the flood. I didn't summon the storm. I just stopped holding back the sea. Day 55. Tropical storm Helene formed off the coast of Georgia and started tracking northeast toward the South Carolina low country. I watched the weather maps at my desk while the wind picked up outside. The National Hurricane Center issued a tropical storm warning for Beaufort County. Heavy rainfall, storm surge advisory, king tide coinciding with landfall. The worst combination. I put on my boots and drove to Palmetto Bluffs Estates. One last time. I knocked on every door I could reach. Some people didn't answer. Some looked through the blinds and turned away. The ones who opened the door heard me say the same thing. Get flood insurance now. Today. Call your agent. Your home is in a flood zone. The developer lied to you about the designation. The storm is coming, and the levee on my property has not been maintained for 60 days. I am telling you this so you can protect yourselves. Perry Ashworth went with me again. He'd already purchased flood insurance for his own home. Cost him $4,000, but he had coverage. Most didn't. Darla appeared on the sidewalk behind us at the third block. She must have gotten a call. She followed us door to door in her white SUV, getting out at every stop, contradicting everything I said. Don't listen to him. He's trying to scare you into paying him off. Our homes are not in a flood zone. The county records are clear. The FEMA maps are clear. This man is a fraud. I turned to her on the sidewalk, in front of a house on Marsh Elder Court. The sky behind her was the color of a bruise. The wind was pulling at her hair, unraveling the shellacked helmet for the first time since I'd met her. Mrs. Covington, I said, in 72 hours, the tide and the truth are going to arrive at the same time. She opened her mouth, closed it. For 1 second, just one, I saw something behind her eyes that might have been fear. Then the mask snapped back. You'll be hearing from our lawyers, she said. Day 58. Tropical storm Helene made landfall south of Beaufort at 4 in the morning. I was already awake. The rain had been hammering the roof for 6 hours. Not normal rain. Horizontal sheets that sounded like gravel being thrown against the windows. The wind howled through the live oaks. Branches cracked and fell like gunshots. I stood on the back porch with a spotlight aimed at the levee. The tidal creek had swollen to 3 times its normal width. The water was brown. It pushed against the earthen wall with a sound I'd never heard before. A deep, grinding moan, like the earth itself was in pain. At 4:17 in the morning, the levee gave way. The breach opened at the weakest point, a section near the southeast corner where the clay had been softening for weeks without maintenance. It didn't explode, it exhaled. A section of wall simply sagged, then slumped, and the water poured through like it had been waiting its whole life for this moment. And maybe it had. I watched the surge cross the gravel road Trent's crew had laid on my pasture. It swallowed the road in seconds. Then it spread. A dark, salt-smelling sheet of water moving across the land with terrible patience. It reached the first row of homes within minutes. I heard the car alarms first. Then the security lights flickered and went out as the water found the electrical panels. The smell hit me even from my porch. That thick, brackish stink of pluff mud and salt marsh. The smell of the low country reclaiming what had always belonged to it. 2 feet of water in the first hour. 4 feet by dawn. Every home in Palmetto Bluffs Estates flooded. Every single one. $40 million in damage by the conservative estimate. 0 flood insurance. My property sat on the high ground. The farmhouse, the barn, the dock, all dry. Because Emmett Crawley didn't just build a levee. He built his home where the water couldn't reach. 4 generations of knowing the land. 4 generations of respecting it. You don't build on a floodplain and dare the ocean to come get you. The ocean always wins. It just takes its time. The emergency county commissioners meeting happened 3 days after the storm. The community center in Beaufort was standing room only. 100 homeowners, local media, 2 television cameras. The commissioners sat behind a long table on a raised platform, with microphones that squealed with feedback every time someone raised their voice. Darla Covington took the podium first. She was wearing a navy blazer over a white blouse, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked rattled. But her voice was steady. Bennett Crawley deliberately sabotaged the levee protecting our community, she said. He let it fail on purpose during a tropical storm. He should be charged with criminal destruction of property. The room split. Half the audience clapped. The other half sat in silence. I noticed Perry Ashworth in the third row. He caught my eye and nodded. When my name was called, I walked to the podium, carrying a cardboard file box. The box was heavy. I set it on the table and pulled out 2 documents. I held them up, one in each hand. This is the original survey of the Crawley property, conducted in 1962 by a licensed surveyor named Holt. And this is the plat filed with Beaufort County in 2019. I laid them side by side under the overhead projector. The 2 maps filled the screen behind me. Even from the back row, you could see it. The property line on the original survey followed the natural ridge along the tidal creek. The line on the 2019 plat was straight as a ruler, drawn 200 feet south. 200 feet, I said. 15 acres. Stolen from my family with a forged document filed by a corrupt county clerk. I turned to the audience. I could feel the silence pressing against me like water pressure. The county clerk who certified this plat was Wendell Pruitt. Wendell Pruitt is Darla Covington's first cousin. A murmur ran through the room. I pulled the next document. These are the elevation certificates submitted to FEMA for Palmetto Bluffs estates. Every certificate was prepared by the same surveyor who drew the forged plat. Every certificate lists the base flood elevation at least 4 feet lower than the actual measurement. I let that hang for a moment. Based on these falsified certificates, FEMA reclassified this area from Zone AE, high flood risk, to Zone X, minimal risk. Your lender stopped requiring flood insurance. 100 families bought homes in a flood zone without $1 of protection. Lowell Fitch stood up from his seat in the second row. The commissioners recognized him as a licensed independent surveyor with 38 years of experience. He walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and said 6 words that ended the debate. The 2019 plat is a fraud. Then a woman in a dark pantsuit stood up from the back of the room. She identified herself as a representative from the FEMA Office of Chief Counsel. She confirmed the elevation certificates were inconsistent with independent measurements. She confirmed the flood zone designation should have been Zone AE, high risk, mandatory insurance. Every person in that room went quiet, the kind of quiet you hear before a verdict. I looked out at those faces. People who'd put their savings, their dreams, their children's futures into homes they've been told were safe. And I said what I've been holding for months. Every person in this room was told their home was safe from flooding. That was a lie. They were told they didn't need flood insurance. That was a lie. They were told my family's land belonged to the community. That was a lie. I paused. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The only thing that wasn't a lie was the levee my great-grandfather built, and it sat on land that was stolen from us. I looked directly at Trent Covington, who was sitting in the front row with his lawyer. His face was the color of wet cement. You want to know who flooded your homes? It wasn't the storm. It wasn't me. It was the man who told you the water would never come. The room erupted. Not at me, at Trent, at Darla, at the lie they'd all been living inside. Before the noise died down, 2 men in dark suits walked through the side door, federal agents. They approached Trent first. Wire fraud, FEMA fraud, land fraud. He stood up slowly, like a man whose legs had forgotten how to work. His lawyer tried to intervene. The agents were polite but firm. Wendell Pruitt was next. They found him in the parking lot, sitting in his car with the engine running. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Falsification of government records. The third arrest happened in the lobby. Darla Covington was halfway to the exit when the agent stepped in front of her. Accessory to fraud. Obstruction. She started to say something. I could see her mouth moving from across the room, but no sound came out. Perry Ashworth started clapping, slow, deliberate. One person joined him, then another, then the whole room. 100 homeowners who finally understood who had really put their homes underwater. The federal grand jury handed down indictments 6 weeks later. Trent Covington faced 14 counts, including wire fraud, FEMA fraud, and conspiracy to commit land fraud. Sentencing guidelines put him at 20 to 25 years. His development company filed for bankruptcy within the month. Wendell Pruitt pleaded guilty to conspiracy and falsification of public records, 5 to 10 years. He resigned from the county clerk's office the same day. Darla Covington was charged as an accessory, 3 to 5 years. Her attorney tried to argue she was an innocent bystander who trusted her brother-in-law. The judge noted that Darla had filed false HOA violations, orchestrated a fraudulent CPS complaint against a 12-year-old boy, and distributed defamatory communications to 100 homeowners. Innocent was not the word that fit. The 100 homeowners filed a class action lawsuit against Trent's development company. $40 million in flood damage. The case settled for $38 million. Not everything came back. You can't get back the photo albums that floated away. But the money helped, and the truth helped more. My 15 acres came home. The court restored the 1962 boundary. The homes that sat partially on Crawley property were given the option to purchase a legitimate easement at fair market value. Most did. The money went into the farm. I rebuilt the levee. Took me 3 months with a proper engineering firm. Reinforced clay core, riprap along the tidal side, drainage weirs. The new wall would hold against the Category 3 surge, but I didn't do it for charity. The HOA signed a 30-year maintenance agreement, annual payments to cover upkeep, inspection, and repair. In exchange, I granted a permanent conservation easement protecting the salt marsh and tidal creek from future development. The marsh was safe. The creek was safe. No one would ever bulldoze that land again. The new HOA board looked nothing like the old one. Perry Ashworth was elected president by unanimous vote. His first official act was a formal written apology to the Crawley family, read aloud at a community meeting attended by every homeowner in the subdivision. Jolene cried. She'd deny it, but she cried. Perry's second act was a new bylaw requiring every homeowner to carry flood insurance at the Zone AE level. No exceptions, no waivers, no trusting the developer's word. I used part of the easement payments and part of the settlement money to establish the Emmett Crawley Low Country Heritage Fund. The fund provides grants to low country families fighting to keep their ancestral land. It also funds flood zone education for communities that don't know their homes are at risk. Because that was the real crime, not just stealing my land, stealing the truth from 100 families who deserved to know where they were building their lives. Last Saturday, Grayson and I walked down to the tidal creek with our fishing rods. The levee stood solid behind us, new dirt packed over old clay. The marsh grass had already started growing up the sides, stitching the wall back into the landscape like a scar that the land was healing over. We sat on the dock my grandfather built. The tide was coming in. Mullet jumped in the shallows. A great blue heron stood in the Spartina grass on the far bank, absolutely still, watching the water with the patience of something that has been here longer than any of us. Grayson cast his line. The reel clicked. The cork bobbed in the current. "Dad," he said. "Yeah? Are they going to try to take our land again?" I looked out at the creek, at the marsh, at the live oaks on the ridge where Emmett Crawley had stood 70 years ago, and decided this was home. "No," I said, "not ever again." The Spanish moss swayed in the breeze. The water rose. The heron didn't move. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs you everything. Especially then. If this story hit you in the chest, do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done? Would you have let the levee go? Or would you have kept protecting the people who stole from you? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've got an HOA nightmare of your own, I want to hear it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because next week, we've got a story about a woman whose HOA president tried to bulldoze her dead mother's garden. She fought back with a weapon nobody saw coming. You don't want to miss it.
And that's where this one settles. Not in the courtroom. It settles at a creek bank, with a father and son holding fishing rods. Watching the leaf they review hold back the tide. Trans Covington didn't fail because of bad weather. He fails because he built an empire on the line. He erased a family from a deed. He froze a map. He told 100 families their homes were safe when he knew they weren't. The man he tried to erase was the one person who could read every line on the map. The lesson is simple. Know your property rights. Keep the original documents. Never assume county records are correct just because they are official. Bennett didn't need a bag. He needed a 60-year-old survey and the patience to let the truth surface on its own schedule. If you ever had your land or your rights taken by someone who thought a signature made it legal, tell me in the comments. Hit subscribe because next time we got a retired judge whose HOA fined her for flying the American flag. They didn't know he wrote the statute they were violating. That one is different.